Welcome back, everyone. We've got a terrific discussion lined up. And before I turn things over to Russ to start talking with Denise Michel, who's the Director of Online Intellectual Property Enforcement and Protection at Facebook, let me just say a few words about Russ, because I know Russ is going to get Denise talking about her career, so we're going to learn about her shortly. Russ is a partner at the Seed IP Law Group, and before that he has been involved with some of the most interesting and important trademark issues at great companies. He was the global head of trademarks at Microsoft, and he also worked in the Copyright and Trade Secret group there. He also worked at Intel. So Russ has had his hands in so many important things, and so I'm really looking forward to this conversation he's going to be having with Denise. Russ.
Thank you very much, Jeannie. And I am thrilled to be up here today with Denise Michel. As Jeannie just mentioned, Denise is the Director of Online Intellectual Property Enforcement and Protection, but also left off of that, if you saw in the bio, is the responsibility for DNS strategy. So in the course of my career, I have dabbled into the internet policy space and had to interact a fair amount with ICANN as well. But in looking into what Denise has done, I do what every good investigative lawyer does, and instead of just reading her bio, I go to social media. And I look into what she has been doing. And in this particular case, because this is a professional audience, I went directly to LinkedIn. And I come to realize, in the course of finding all these fun words like cybersecurity and ICANN and GDPR and phishing and spoofing and all that, it's fabulous. I went back a little bit further and find out that Denise got her start actually in government. And so I thought it'd be interesting to hear from Denise what her background was in government that led through to her Facebook position. So Denise, if you could enlighten us, that'd be great.
Thanks, Russ. Can you guys hear me? Great. And thanks for the reminder to update my social media privacy settings too. So I started out actually working in the U.S. Senate while I was in college, and became interested in academic and commercial research and the sort of the nexus of government, universities, and technology companies and some of the new technologies that they were advancing. That led me to work briefly at the National Science Foundation. Soon after, they had moved DARPANET over to the National Science Foundation, and then worked with at the time, largest high-tech trade association when then Senator Gore started working on bringing together the country's supercomputer centers, networking them. So I worked on things like the high-performance computing initiative that was passed in the early 90s. And then in the first Clinton-Gore administration, I was appointed as a senior technology advisor and was responsible for managing the creation of the world's first comprehensive national initiative to support and advance the internet, which was in its infancy at the time. I'm much older, hopefully, than I look. So I there coordinated a number of cross-departmental groups in creating and executing essentially the first plan we had on advancing the internet. It was very much based on a industry, academic, government partnership. And one of the things we flagged as a critical path element that needed to be addressed was intellectual property rights. In addition to high-speed switching and many other elements at the time. Then I went and worked in the Silicon Valley in the startup world for a time. And then ICANN was getting off the ground in the late 1990s. And so I became part of the executive team that took ICANN from a small startup to a global institution that coordinates the internet's domain names, protocols, addresses, or the infrastructure elements, and worked on a whole variety of foundational sort of structures and issues to get ICANN off the ground, and we'll, I think, talk more about what ICANN is. It's the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, if you don't know, and what it does. And as you know now, I work at Facebook, doing not only intellectual property enforcement and protection, but also a range of domain name system support and activities. I have a wonderful team and people that support this, and excellent global network of vendors and outside councils that help us with that. Looking forward to speaking with all of you about it further.
So when Jeannie got up there and started telling my bio, and I sat up and felt very good about myself, I then read about, hear about, and listen to what people like Denise and all I've accomplished, and I realize how very small I am. So very, very happy to be up here with you. Last week was the World Economic Forum in Davos, and in my spare time I decided I wanted to listen into some of the speaking that was going on, because my former boss at Microsoft, Brad Smith, was actually there, and so I thought, they're inviting him to be there to speak about some of these cybersecurity issues. I want to hear what's going on. And when there was a panel of some tech industry folks involved, he opened up with a pretty broad comment, and it was, if we're trying to describe in a single sentence what we're trying to accomplish, we being the tech industry, it's about trying to keep the world safe. The world depends on digital infrastructure, and people depend on their digital devices, as I am right now. And what we've all found is that these devices are all under attack every day. And that, to me, made me step back and think, you're in the tech world, you're with Facebook. What's Facebook's position on this? Are you feeling the same way as Brad is?
Absolutely. And speaking of mobile, there's been in recent years annually over 50% increase in malware on mobile devices. There's been a significant shift to mobile devices and abuse in apps. It's a very dynamic area, and one of the reasons I was interested in talking to all of you today is because this is such a fast-moving arena, and because there is such a strong connection between intellectual property, trademark protection and enforcement, and security. At Facebook, we work very closely with our security teams, and the most common enforcement issues that an intellectual property person in a company or organization sees is literally the tip of the spear, and the way a significant amount of security breaches occur. So I'm interested in digging into that more, but we're seeing some profound shifts in attack vectors, and this is a significant commitment and priority for my company, certainly.
Wonderful. I'm going to take a step back for a second. She had mentioned having a role in ICANN, and I realized that we do have a lot of law students in the room too, so I thought it would be worthwhile for us to step back and as a trademark practitioner, there has been a group of trademark practitioners that are getting very active in the ICANN space, and has had to for quite a while, because trademarks are literally under attack in the domain space. But for the law students in the room, can you explain what ICANN is, what its role and function is in the ecosystem?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So ICANN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, was created in 1998, I believe, through an agreement with the U.S. Department of Commerce, NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Agency. It was hearkening back to that original internet plan that we created. Part of the plan was to move the responsibility for domain names and protocols and addresses out of the Commerce Department and into the private sector with a private-public partnership. So ICANN was created in 1998 to coordinate the sort of infrastructure layer of the internet, specifically the domain databases and coordination involving domains, addresses, and protocols. It's a not-for-profit California-based corporation. It has a permanent staff, a board of directors that's elected by various stakeholder groups, and stakeholder groups represent sort of the large sectors of entities and organizations that are impacted or involved in the internet. So each of these stakeholder groups has a role in working together to develop proposed policies, sort of global standards that impact domains and addresses and those types of things. The board's responsible for approving that and implementing these global policies. Things like the new GTLD, new domain names, top-level domains, that's a policy that was approved by the board and then implemented. So there are registrars where if you want to register a domain name, you go to a registrar to do it, the retail registrars. There's registries, each top-level domain to the right of the .com, .science, .xyz has one registry that maintains a master database. So there's registrars and registries involved in ICANN. There's also hundreds of governments that are represented there. Security experts have a special advisory committee. There is a business constituency, there's an intellectual property constituency, there's a constituency that represents the world's internet users, sort of individual users. And so it is structured to be a bottom-up policy development and coordinating body. It is not a governmental body. It is not governed by an international treaty. It is a very unique institution. It gets its revenue or operating funds from fees on every domain name that a registrar registers and a registry holds in its database. And so, just like the internet, ICANN over the last 20 years has grown in both size and complexity. And like many international organizations, it is finding it challenging at this point to balance the competing interests and develop global policies that, frankly, serve the public interest. And so Facebook and many other companies I see represented in this room today participate in ICANN in various ways to help support creating a useful and balanced approach to these policies and procedures and standards.
That's a great explanation, thanks. This whole bottom-up stakeholder model is unique and is supported by so many of these companies, but it also puts a lot of tension on the dialogue that happens. She mentioned that a bunch of governments are also represented. They're represented in what is the Government Advisory Committee, the GAC it's called. Most governments are not used to being involved in policy development only from an advisory capacity. The board here is what's making the decisions. So if the U.S. government representatives are in there and have a position they want to take, it doesn't automatically happen, even though ICANN's located in California. They're part of this broader constituency that collectively puts together advice for the board to consider, and then the board will take its action based off of the input from all of the various constituencies. So it's very interesting. But equally impacted, like all of the rest of us, whether it's business, et cetera, when a certain region does have a policy come in that's going to implicate whether something's legal or illegal. Most recently, we've all been hearing a lot about GDPR, a wonderful acronym, and there are all kinds of acronyms in ICANN. But the European Union's global data protection rights policies that have just gone into, they've been implemented last year, have impacted brand owners quite a bit. First of all, so we can get an underlying basis for it, can you explain what the GDPR is? And then we can go from there into how it's actually impacting trademark owners.
Sure. And I should also note that I'll be using a lot of acronyms, I think I have already, and referencing various things. I will put together a page with links and give it to Christine, who will post it on the McCarthy Symposium website, so you'll have follow-up access to a number of things that I'm referencing as I speak here today. So the GDPR is not new, but it is the biggest change to privacy regulations in Europe in the past 2 decades. It entered into force on May 25th, 2018. and it's focused on protecting data that allows the identification of individuals, personal data. So and importantly, it comes with very high sanctions for violations. And so in a nutshell, the GDPR establishes rules on how companies, governments, and other entities can process the personal data of citizens who are EU citizens or residents. And while the privacy of personal data obviously is a good thing, Facebook is committed, and I know companies and others in this room very committed to complying with GDPR and supporting personal privacy. It's also important to recognize the purposeful and very important limitations of GDPR. It's limited in scope. It is not applicable to legal persons, just natural persons, or to data of non-EU citizens obtained, processed outside of the US. And it's also important to recognize the various bases under the GDPR for maintaining and obtaining personal information. It is intended to, as I said, protect the personal data, but it also recognizes specifically legitimate uses of this data, including uses to support cybersecurity and consumer protection among intellectual property protection, among others. We've been collectively working with companies and academia, security experts, government, law enforcement, a very broad global alliance to help ICANN develop rules and policies that take a balanced approach to GDPR. And GDPR is so important in the ICANN and domain world because of some fairly recent decisions that ICANN took on how they were going to interpret and apply GDPR to the WHOIS database. And just to make sure everyone understands what the WHOIS database is, because we're going to be talking about this quite a bit, it is the registration information for domain names. It's called the WHOIS record. Anytime anyone registers a domain name, information is collected but not validated. Collected in a WHOIS record, and prior to May 25th was publicly accessible in particular forms. Privacy proxy services could mask the WHOIS record, in which case we would go to the privacy proxy service to get the WHOIS record if we had documented reasons for accessing it. So how ICANN has interpreted and applied the GDPR to WHOIS has been a very strong focus of stakeholder groups and of ICANN recently.
So, and as you can tell, because it's a bottom-up stakeholder model, ICANN, in anticipation of this, knew that they were going to have to go through a policy development process to come to a final resolution on how they would deal with it and what they would do with all the personal information that's gathered when registrants would register domain names. And so what they did put into place was something that they called a temporary specification that was supposed to allow people who had a legitimate need to gain access to that information to still try and get the WHOIS information. However, registrars who were the folks who were actually gathering that data decided that they would take a more aggressive view of it and say, we don't want to be considered in violation of the European GDPR, and so therefore we are just going to redact all WHOIS information that has anything to do with that particular registrant. They'll still leave in IP addresses and a few other things, but they're not going to have any of that visible to anybody. Many in the industry thought that that was a little bit extreme because they, by definition, were also blocking corporations that were actually registering domains, and the whole purpose of this privacy law was actually aimed at protecting the individuals. So there has been a lot of tension in the discussions that are happening at the ICANN level. And at the same time, though, ICANN recognized that they needed to get this process through quickly, so they put together a working group that was going to try and come up with an expedited policy development process that could address this. What has been your opinion of how that process is going?
Well, that's a big, hairy question. Perhaps, especially for those who aren't immersed in the domain and internet infrastructure world, let me give you a little bit more background so you can understand what's at play here. So, a whole global range of stakeholders and users use the WHOIS data to do a whole range of critical things on the internet. It's used to previously was used to obtain real-world identity of who has registered and is holding a domain name. That contact information was important to verify that a legitimate merchant is behind a website at that domain. Or if you want to purchase a domain, you use the WHOIS record to verify that someone, portraying themselves as the owner of that domain was indeed actually the owner of the domain. It facilitated transfers between registrars. It allowed companies' security experts to identify a domain name registrant, the person who held the domain name, if it was being used for a DDoS attack or malware or something else, if it had been hijacked. It was used extensively by law enforcement and by cybersecurity professionals to investigate a whole range of criminal and abusive behavior. So that's sort of important background on the WHOIS record. And over the past 20 years, ICANN has made numerous very clear and unambiguous public promises and statements and representations on its commitment to coordinate and maintain the global WHOIS data and keep it accessible and useful for these legitimate purposes. And so ICANN unfortunately came late to the game in trying to determine how GDPR applies to its responsibilities, and specifically the WHOIS database. Again, many of you in this room who work for companies understand the significant amount of time over the last couple of years companies have spent in interpreting and applying and creating plans and making changes to come into compliance with GDPR. In October of 2017, ICANN began releasing its own legal memos interpreting GDPR and how it might apply to the WHOIS database. And then in November of 17, it suspended all compliance requirements. That is, the registrars and registries have contracts with ICANN. Those contracts allow them to be authorized registrars and registries. And the contracts also contain a number of obligations for registrars and registries, including security protocols and responsibilities to maintain and publish the WHOIS database. And in ICANN also in late 2017 asked the community for proposed models for balancing the use and privacy in the WHOIS database. And then subsequently, I should tell you, the businesses, intellectual property interests, security interests have been very strongly engaged in this issue, providing ICANN with a significant amount of data, information, proposals for how to move forward with this. Ultimately, ICANN did not accept these proposals and this guidance, and came up with a temporary specification. So it's not a global permanent policy, but it's a short-term, sort of one-year fix for this issue. And the temporary spec allows registrars and registries to pull almost all of the WHOIS data out of public access, and including any email any personally identifiable information. It does not distinguish between whether it's a business or a person. All of the data gets pulled from the public. It also doesn't distinguish geographic location either. And although the temporary spec that was approved by the board in May allows registrars to pull this data, it acknowledges that there are legitimate uses to accessing this data for cybersecurity, intellectual property, consumer protection, and other uses. It did not provide any specific guidance as to how that would be done. And so subsequently, the registrars and registries, almost across the board, pulled this data out of the public access. Many registrars and registries are not even complying with the minimum amount of data that ICANN indicated. Registrars and registries still had to provide publicly the name server information, some basic infrastructure information. Even that, in some cases, is not being displayed. And it is a very fluid and confusing time for the WHOIS record and for registrars and registries. As you would expect, and understandably, ICANN registrars and registries are themselves, trying to interpret and apply GDPR. They're concerned about liability. They're concerned about potential violations, trying to understand how to apply it in a way that is in their interests. And so we don't have any uniform way of making requests to the registrars and registries to provide WHOIS information, domain information for a whole range of cybersecurity, intellectual property, and other issues. And so that's kind of brings us up to the state of play in August. ICANN launched a expedited policy development process. So that means they pulled together representatives from all the different interest groups, stakeholder groups within ICANN, and on a accelerated basis, this group is tasked with creating a balanced and permanent policy on WHOIS that all the registrars and registries would have to follow. Within about a week, they're expected to issue a report. Unfortunately, they're calling this phase one, not a policy, but say a first step to a policy. It does not provide or acknowledge in any specific ways the legitimate uses of WHOIS data or how we might access it. So there's still a long ways to go in this policy development process.
So we're 9 months now that we're into February from when the GDPR launched, and the Expedited Policy Development Working Group has a phase one for what is going to be an expedited policy to be able to address something that's already happening. Let's make this a little bit more real. Let's use some examples. Cyber attacks that we talked about in the earlier comments. There's an organization that's the Cybersecurity Tech Accord, of which Facebook is a signatory. And they put out an article in November that tells some pretty interesting stories about various attacks that have happened to Facebook and others, and get to the importance of being able to have access to WHOIS information. So there was a little organization called the Liberty Front Press. Can you tell me a little bit about that story? Sure. And how it came about?
Sure. So the Tech Accord, to give you a little bit of background, and again, I'll be providing links so you can look into this further if you'd like, is a new organization that was formed within the last year. I think it's, we think up to 80, I think, companies and organizations are members, and the intention is to collaborate both with each other, these companies, as well as academia, governments, and other organizations to improve safety and security of cyberspace, and particularly for users. And so we have been working with the Tech Accord in addition to other organizations to make sure they understand and are active in this space to help ICANN hopefully work through its challenges on WHOIS. And as part of that, we provided some very specific examples of just how WHOIS impacts cybersecurity. And so the incident that Russ is referring to happened recently. One of Facebook's vendors helped us identify an information operations campaign that was targeting the US and European countries. It identified an extensive, the vendor identified an extensive influence operation that originated in Iran by linking a network of inauthentic news sites via with a whole host of domains. And so FireEye, the vendor, and Facebook set about investigating this as soon as we discovered its existence. And based on the information, and it was in August of 2018, Facebook removed 650 pages from our website, 650 pages, groups, and accounts. Actually, from our websites, these were coordinated inauthentic behavior that, as I noted, originated in Iran, targeted people across multiple internet services, including in the Middle East, Latin America, the UK, and the US. And so the investigators uncovered these inauthentic news sites that were supported by a whole network of websites and domain names by using WHOIS. This investigation started before May 25th, when the WHOIS went dark, and continued afterwards. The investigators used the domain name registrant information, such as the email address and others, that they obtained from the WHOIS record to associate the domain names and websites. And by pivoting off of specific information that's contained in the WHOIS database, such as the email address of the registrant or the ISP or the servers that are used, they're then able to, and using reverse WHOIS, which is their historic database of WHOIS information, they're able to find other domains that are linked to the same information. And by pivoting on that WHOIS information and using the WHOIS record, they were able to identify a very large number of domains involved in this attack. Literally, as the investigators were working through this, before their eyes, the WHOIS records disappeared for domains that were involved in this cyber attack. And so a consequence of pulling WHOIS out of the public sphere and not providing any real access to this information for cybersecurity investigations such as this caused the investigation to take longer, and it lessened our confidence that we've actually identified all of the domains active in this network. And I'll give you a link if you'd like more information on this particular attack, and it's linked to WHOIS.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one, and that's sort of an example of an origin of a nation that's actually attacking and interfering with information in the U.S. But bringing it back to trademarks, you actually also had a phishing experience. Facebook's the owner of many famous brands. Among them is the Instagram brand, and there was an Instagram with an N on the end of it, .xyz site. Yep. That was actually out there and involved in a phishing scam. Tell us that one very quickly, and then we'll try and get to some solutions.
Sure. So again, before May 25 of last year, the domain name Instagram with an N on the end, .xyz, was launched and linked to a phishing attack. And the WHOIS record, this is our had been our normal protocols, the WHOIS record was immediately used to identify the ISP hosting the website. We submitted a complaint, took it offline, and then we used the additional data in the Whois record to conduct a reverse Whois. We looked at historical Whois records using those Whois data elements to search and using the registrar information that we found. We found 17,000 domain names that a single registrant had held. And our analysis of this domain portfolio identified another 50 domain names that infringed on both Facebook and Instagram, well, all three actually, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp trademarks. And many of those were being used for either phishing attacks or distributing malware. And so, as you would expect, these websites also were taken down as we quickly contacted the ISPs and had them suspended. And then, while the ISPs have the websites offline, we also filed a uniform dispute resolution process, a UDRP complaint, to regain control of those infringing domain names. So again, this is a great example of how we take one domain name that we find engaged in criminal activity. We use the Whois record to find and mitigate phishing and malware attacks, and we're able to quickly address these 50 domain names. If this had happened after May 25th, we would not be able to respond and protect our users in the way that we've done.
Yes, the article's fascinating. We'll provide you a link. It also includes examples that Microsoft had a phishing attack as well. We had Panasonic also had one. So there's some very real examples, and it also talks about a couple of interesting surveys that have been done where, you know, ICANN likes to work off of real data. So it's helpful to go out and do some survey work and find out who is being impacted by this. One of the organizations, the Messaging, Malware, and Mobile Anti-Abuse Working Group, and again, a great acronym, M3AAWG, they partnered up with the Anti-Phishing Working Group, the APWG, to conduct a survey of cyber investigators and find out what the impact has been. And you can imagine, we won't get into it because we're going to be running short, and I want to make sure we have time for a couple of questions, but their survey came back that virtually across the board, investigators are being hindered by the lack of information available now that Whois has gone dark. And then another organization, a vendor out there called Aptitex, has done some direct attempts post-temp spec to try and find out by calling in with legitimate bases, which is supposed to be the reason you're able to get the information out of registrars. And over 90% of the time, even with a legitimate basis for trying to get the information, those registrars were still not providing it. So it has been a very difficult time for brand owners to try and enforce in the domain space. So where do we go from here?
What a great question. So ideally, if I had a magic wand, that's one of Russ's questions. If I had a magic wand, we would convince the ICANN board and staff to, along with their temporary spec that removes the Whois data, we would add some language that provides guidance to registrars and registries to ensure that they temporarily provide access for well-documented uses of Whois, cybersecurity attacks, consumer IP protection. And then we would, again with the magic wand, follow that temporary measure up with a permanent global policy that balances privacy and public interest and provides the appropriate access to legitimate uses of Whois. It's going to be very challenging. The registrars and registries and have a very strong role in ICANN, as you would imagine. This is their business. They have a command of the minutia, and put considerable resources into ICANN's policy and protocol development efforts. And so it's always a challenge to make sure that the user needs and perspectives are well represented at the table, and that we help convince ICANN to take a measured approach to this. So we're still working on this issue. As you can tell, it's really in a state of flux. Not only working to try and convince ICANN, the registrars and registries, to put more effective measures in place to provide cybersecurity and IP access, but also we are represented in the policy development group trying to help them create a balanced formal policy. I think there's a number of other things that we can do, and I also have some advice for those in the audience if you'd like some unsolicited but free advice from me. At Facebook and I think other companies, we work extremely closely with our security teams. We've increased over the last year our sort of security-related teams at Facebook by 50%. We have about 30,000 people working worldwide in this space. The infringement and abuse of intellectual property, trademarks, is the mechanism of choice to launch cybersecurity attacks, criminal behavior. And so I would, for those that are considering an IP protection career, or who have that and related responsibilities at your company, because this is such a fluid space, it is evolving so quickly, and the threats are growing, I would encourage you to connect with your security teams in your companies. Make sure you understand what the current impact is, and what your threat portfolio looks like. I would also encourage you to make sure that you work with your enforcement vendors if you're a company. Make sure you understand what they're doing. Facebook and many other companies are using vendors to document the need for WHOIS information and request the WHOIS records. We're getting them about anywhere from 5 to 15% of the time. So to be clear, a well-documented phishing attack provided to a registrar with documentation of our registered trademarks and a request for the WHOIS data, 90% of the time or more is either ignored. I think 50% of the time there's no response at all, and then the rest of the time, totaling about 90%, we do not get a WHOIS record. And so that's how critical this space is right now. I would encourage you to work with your companies, work with your vendors to make sure you understand what processes they're using, make sure that they're requesting the WHOIS information, understand if you have an infringing, abusive domain name involved in your enforcement activities, understand whether they're simply suspending it at the ISP level, which means they contact the ISP takes it offline. If they're doing that, and also following through to contact the registrar and get the domain name back. It takes me about 5 minutes to pull up one of my 50,000 domain names and change the ISPs. There are thousands, literally all over the world. So we find ourselves in a big, giant game of whack-a-mole with a lot of vendors and companies and attorneys doing ISP suspensions only to see the domain name come right back up in a matter of hours or days. I'd also encourage you to pursue formal and informal partnerships with other companies, academia, trade associations. I would encourage you to contact your trade association and get them involved in this issue. If you yourselves or your company can't spend time at ICANN encouraging and promoting a balanced resolution of this project, I would encourage, please encourage your trade associations to do so as well.
All right, I think we are out of time, but David, one or two questions for me?
Yeah, do we have questions from the audience? I'll run around with the mic. Do we? Here.
Only if there's no one else. All right, so the UDRP has been one of the great successes, I think, of dealing with these issues. Of course, it's more challenging now under the GDRP world because it's hard to prove a pattern of misconduct when you can't see what they're doing. Happily, this is an accident of ICANN. I mean, the UDRP was created by WIPO, Francis Gurry in particular. ICANN approved it, and it's been, for 20 years, our best tool. ICANN has a review process now that is looking at the UDRP, and there's many of us who are quite concerned about what ICANN might do to undermine the effectiveness of the UDRP. I wonder if you could comment on the UDRP review process.
Yes, thank you. So the UDRP process was one of the early successes of ICANN. I think in 1999, perhaps, created it. There is a proposal to review the UDRP. It has not started yet. There's a policy development process that is developing a policy on subsequent procedures that would be used when another round of new GTLDs is launched. And also there's another policy development process looking at rights protection mechanisms in the GTLD space. As part of those efforts, there's a plan to address, take a look at, and potentially update the UDRP, but the UDRP specific action has not occurred to date. And because the policy development process is stretched so thin with the WHOIS and other activities, it's unclear if and when they're going to get to any UDRP changes.
Your point and concern is very valid, though, because it is like any other rule that they have in ICANN in existence. They want to assess whether it's working, and what they're using as the reason for opening it is all of the rights protection mechanisms that were built into the new GTLD program. It was built in that when those were being implemented, that there was also going to be a review of those a year after all of the new GTLDs had launched. And so that was what was opening it up. Of course, registries and registrars wanted to say, as long as we're looking at these things, let's look at all of them, and it makes sense for us to look at UDRP too, because we think that you evil brand owners are out there seizing domains that are rightfully owned by others. So it is lumped in with the rights protection measures review that's going on, but as was indicated, nothing is happening yet, and it's getting kind of kicking the can down the road. And hopefully it'll be very little scrutiny on UDRP and focus much more on whether or not the URS and the other mechanisms are still working. One last question, because we're already over time. Go ahead.
I always find the enforcement strategies of other brands pretty enlightening. With respect to the Instagram with an n.xyz matter that you were talking about earlier, I was wondering if you can go into a little bit more about the strategy that you applied in going after this one person, where you found one domain name, then filed a UDRP, or whatever the domain name resolution process was, and then you ran a reverse WHOIS, went to the ISPs, suspended those registrations, and then filed another UDRP. If you can go into
Sure.
whether that was a good strategy and whether you
Yep.
would do it otherwise.
Yep. So at any given time, my team has about 100,000 domain names that are in any part of our long enforcement workflow. For phishing attacks, we find them as fast as possible, suspend them as fast as possible to stop the harm to consumers. Then we investigate, and because we file so many UDRPs, we try and be as efficient as possible, and we do our investigation, find connected domains that we can include, and wherever possible, we file a bundled UDRP to get the names back. And that's what we did in this case. We suspended them, investigated, found the 50 domains, then filed a bundled UDRP.
Wonderful. All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Denise.